Hey YNR fans! Waving hand, welcome to YNR Trends, your go-to spot for the juiciest Young and the Restless updates, shocking spoilers, and all the drama you can't stop talking about. From surprise returns to scandalous twists, we break it all down for you, every day. So grab your coffee, hit that subscribe button, and let's dive right into Genoa City's hottest gossip. According to Friday, August 22nd, spoilers for The Young and the Restless, Audra Charles will confess to Nate Hastings, and Kane Ashby will have a top-secret assignment for Phyllis Summers. Let's start by discussing Kane's directives for Phyllis, as he is going to assign her a task. After adequate planning by Phyllis and Kane, it's time to take concrete action and get closer to Kane's takeover objectives. Will the first task he completes be the little shopping in enemy territory that Kane mentioned using Phyllis's hacking skills for? Is there anything else Kane wants Phyllis to do first? In any event, on Friday's YNR episode, Kane will have a top-secret project for Phyllis to work on. Phyllis will probably pass Kane's test because it will provide her an opportunity to demonstrate her loyalty and value. He will support Audra in a challenging situation with Nate. Audra frequently uses lies to try to talk her out of difficulty or at the very least postpone the inevitable. But since Nate is following his instincts and can see that Audra isn't telling him the truth, that won't work this time. Nate will therefore insist on honesty and possibly caution Audra that their relationship cannot progress without it. Audra might end up in a position where she will undoubtedly lose Nate. Even while Nate will no longer tolerate the lies, Audra won't benefit much from the truth either. However, it appears that Audra will realize that her only choice is to confess. Audra ought to acknowledge that Claire Newman was correct to hire her to separate Claire and Kyle Abbott after Nate puts further pressure on her. Audra may also admit to starting it and try to apologize for all the turmoil she's caused. She also kissed Kyle in an effort to stir things up. Nate may have an issue because Audra doesn't appear to be terribly sorry for any of it. Nate might assume Audra is just sad she was caught, even if she makes an effort to cry and apologize. According to teasers for The Young and the Restless, Audra might soon hear some breakup news. Although Kane had always thought it was better to keep secrets hidden, Genoa City had a way of bringing things to light at the most inconvenient time. He had been working in secret for weeks, excluding even his closest allies, and it all came back to Phyllis. Kane recognized an opportunity when she came to him with one of her outlandish ideas, the kind that most people would have laughed off. Although Kane first convinced himself that he was only a silent investor, her scheme swiftly evolved into something far more deadly and had the potential to upend the foundations of several influential people in the community. Kane, eager to regain his position in Genoa City's leadership, joined Phyllis in this top-secret endeavor because she needed leverage. They had gathered in quiet corners on quiet evenings to discuss shell corporations, digital footprints, and a front that would provide them access to private information that could damage people's reputations. Kane knew in his heart that part of it was ego, but he kept telling himself that he was doing it to safeguard his family's future. In a community that had attempted to expel him, he wished to demonstrate his continued influence. Audra was battling her own issues while Kane and Phyllis were in the shadows, pulling strings. For so long, she had pretended to be a self-assured executive, telling Nate that everything was under control, but she knew she was harboring a lie that was killing her. Every day, the walls of her office seemed to get thinner, stifling her as she gazed at deals, emails, and contracts that might all fall apart if the wrong person asked the wrong question. She told herself it was only business, but her guilt tore at her since she had crossed unbreakable lines. Her hesitation before responding to some of his questions, her avoidance of eye contact whenever he inquired about the Newman project or the abrupt changes in their approach, had all contributed to Nate's developing suspicion. Normally, Audra was the hunter, not the victim, so she wasn't used to being the one in a tight spot. This time, though, she couldn't get rid of the sensation that someone was observing everything she did. Audra poured herself a glass of wine that evening and gazed at her reflection in her apartment's glass wall as the sun dropped beneath the horizon. In her thoughts, she heard Nate's voice asking her again if there was anything she wasn't telling him in a soothing yet sharp tone. His intuition was more keen than she liked to acknowledge, but she had dismissed it previously, laughing it off. She pondered over Kane, overheard murmurs, and the odd bond between him and Phyllis that didn't make sense until she pieced together fragments of lost papers and overheard conversations. With every swallow of wine, the reality pressed deeper into her chest. Nate was the only person she trusted, perhaps not totally, but enough to protect her from losing her hold on him when she had to tell someone. She was at Crimson Lights the following morning, holding on to her coffee more tightly than normal, when Nate slid into the seat across from her. The intensity in his gaze told her he was done making excuses, so he didn't even need to say anything. Before she could stop them, the words came out. She acknowledged that she was aware that Kane and Phyllis were working on a project that would have the potential to completely alter Genoa City's corporate landscape, but she was unaware of its exact scope. Leaning back in shock, Nate's jaw tensed as he took in what she had spoken. Audra acknowledged that she had remained silent out of concern for what may happen if Kane discovered she had spoken. Kane was erratic, and Phyllis even more so. She was afraid of the combo. Her voice trembled as she tried to appear calm, revealing the worry that had been gnawing at her for weeks. She was grounded in the moment as Nate's hand touched hers across the table. Because secrecy only lasted so long before the fractures appeared, he advised her that they needed to be smart about this. Meanwhile, Kane was holding on to the project more tightly. He had persuaded himself that he could handle Phyllis's impetuous behavior by feeding her just enough to satisfy her without disclosing the full plan. However, Phyllis was never one to follow the norms set by others. She was already discussing how to move more quickly, take greater chances, and expose those who were in their way. The ground beneath him began to move, and Kane wondered for the first time if he had misjudged Phyllis's willingness to go thus far. The hum of the city outside reminded him that time was running out as he sat by himself in his office late at night, gazing at the shining laptop screen with files strewn all over the surface. A part of him knew he was heading right into a storm that may destroy him, but he had spent too much to turn back. Neither Nate nor Audra could have fully anticipated the repercussions of Audra's disclosure to him. Now that he knew her truth, Nate had to choose between facing Kane head-on and waiting for more proof. The stakes felt bigger than ever, but he wasn't one to make hasty decisions. Every decision felt like a trap. If he spoke up, he ran the risk of revealing Audra's role in concealing the truth. If he remained silent, Kane's plan might become irreparable. Audra, meanwhile, was both relieved and terrified. She was relieved that she wasn't carrying the load alone, but she was afraid Nate's sense of justice might bring everything to light sooner than she was prepared. She repeatedly relived the scene in her mind, focusing on how his jaw had tightened and his eyes had narrowed. She wasn't sure whether Nate was her greatest threat or her ally, since he wouldn't let this go. A tension that simmered just beneath the surface of courteous conversation and the clinking of fine crockery pervaded the air within the lavish boundaries of the Chancellor Winter's house. However, this particular strain of uneasiness did not originate from the typical family feud or corporate intrigue that so frequently afflicted the dominant family. The poison, which had been carefully distilled over weeks of secret meetings and whispered secrets, was quieter and more personal, and it was now finally approaching its ephemeral edge. The so-called Phyllis Project, a top-secret endeavor commanded by the fearsome Victor Newman, a man for whom the distinction between business and military was always blurred, was the impetus behind this imminent eruption. The weapon was Audra Charles, a woman whose ambition was both her greatest strength and her greatest weakness. The target was Phyllis Summers, a woman of incredible resilience and frenetic energy. Nate Hastings and Audra's impending confession would be more than just an acknowledgement of a botched mission. It would serve as a sobering reminder of the moral concessions required by loyalty to Victor Newman, the brittleness of trust, and the personal price of being a pawn in a game of giants. The special and turbulent past between Victor Newman and Phyllis Summers served as the impetus for the Phyllis Project. An outsider could have assumed that Phyllis's recent behavior, her staged death, her manipulation of others, and her unrelenting efforts to reintegrate herself into her loved ones' lives, were the desperate thrashings of an insane woman. However, Victor saw them as a constant and erratic danger to the system of dominance and power he had spent his entire creating. A spark close to the explosive keg of his family's stability, Phyllis was a renegade variable. She was an issue that needed a long-term, tasteful solution because of her closeness to his son, Daniel, and her complex, frequently damaging ties to his business, Newman Enterprises, and his competitors. Phyllis thrived on conflict and could weaponize victimhood with horrifying efficiency, so a direct assault was not advisable. Something more subdued, a psychological dismantling campaign, was required. She needed to be broken, exposed, and isolated, not by a clear opponent, but by people in her own inner circle. Victor was an expert at creating a situation in which his victim would plan their own destruction. On paper, Audra Charles was the ideal tool for this kind of work. Astute, observant, and very driven, she recognized the value of power in Genoa City and longed to amass more of it. Although she had a good job at Chancellor Winters, it was not the highest position. A tempting route to a larger throne was provided by aligning herself with Victor Newman, the undeniable ruler of the corporate world. Befriending Phyllis was Victor's straightforward idea, but it was executed in a complicated way. Become her most trusted counselor, confidant, and ally. Get her unquestioning trust, then use that trust methodically to guide her toward a sequence of decisions that would expose her darkest tendencies to the world, validating every unfavorable opinion and driving away every ally until she had nowhere else to go. It was an extremely brutal and cynical tactic, based on the betrayal of true human connection and the exploitation of loneliness. The assignment was a test for Audra, an opportunity to demonstrate her value to the city's most influential guy. She agreed, maybe persuading herself that it was just business, a brutal but essential step in the game they all played. She probably buried any embryonic shame beneath the shining prospect of pleasure in the future. The operation's initial phases went smoothly and coldly. Audra spoke to Phyllis as a sympathetic ear rather than as a business competition. She took advantage of the fact that they were both strong, underappreciated women in a world run by strong men. She paid attention to Phyllis's complaints, acknowledged her annoyances, and gave advice that appeared helpful but was deliberately worded to promote irresponsibility. In a time of extreme loneliness, she became the friend Phyllis much needed, a job she performed with terrifying skill. Nate Hastings, however, was in a different orbit that was beginning to converge with Audra's on both a personal and professional level. Nate represented a different set of values as a gifted and morally upright physician who had managed his own complicated ties with the Newman family. Even when it put him at conflict with the Newman Empire, he remained devoted to healing and his own set of moral principles. His relationship with Audra was an intriguing mix of desire and ideological conflict. He was attracted to her ambition and intelligence but frequently leery of the strategies she was prepared to use to advance. The weight of the deceit started to undermine Audra's professional facade as the Phyllis project progressed. The distinction between reality and act began to get hazy. In a few minor, awkward ways, the friendship she was creating started to feel genuine. She witnessed Phyllis's love for her kids, her fragility, and her unadulterated need for connection. These were the intricacies of a profoundly flawed but human creature, not the characteristics of a simple monster who needed to be destroyed. In addition, her contacts with Nate were an unspoken, ongoing indictment of her behavior. His natural decency served as a mirror, reflecting back a more difficult-to-confront side of herself. Because Victor's orders were strict and his punishment for disobedience was legendary, she was unable to share the burden of the secret with him. Because of her omissions and his implicit suspicion that she was involved in something that went against who he thought she was, this led to a widening gap between them. The strain was complex, encompassing the concern of losing the respect of a man she held in high regard, the guilt of betraying a developing friendship, and the fear of failing Victor. When the confession did come, it was probably a gradual, agonizing unraveling rather than a sudden, dramatic declaration. A particularly egregious piece of advice Audra gave Phyllis that backfired, a sudden act of generosity from Phyllis that felt like a physical blow, or a sharp, insightful inquiry from Nate that broke her carefully cultivated demeanor could have been the catalyst. Perhaps in the gentle light of her apartment or in the stillness after a long day, the scene was definitely private, away from the prying eyes and ears of the business world. For weeks, the silence would have weighed heavily on the air. Instead of accusing her, Nate's calm and sympathetic manner would have allowed the truth to surface with a quiet concern that ultimately proved to be her downfall. The actual confession was a flood of repressed humiliation and anguish. Audra would have admitted to the emotional toll the assignment had taken in addition to the facts, the order from Victor, the phony relationship, the deceptive advice. She would talk about the self-loathing that followed each successful manipulation, the nagging shame that accompanied every conversation with Phyllis. She would confess to feeling alone because she was keeping such a poisonous secret and to being afraid of Victor's anger if she failed or was found out. She would, above all, admit that she was afraid of Nate's opinion of her and that he would forever change his opinion of her from one of a strong, ambitious woman to one of a cunning and ruthless manipulator. The main idea of the confession was to ask Nate for forgiveness for her betrayal of her own capacity for kindness, not just to acknowledge that she had betrayed Phyllis. She was making herself extremely exposed by exposing to him the weaknesses in her armor, the struggle between her ambition and her conscience. Nate's response would be a multifaceted emotional mosaic. Not necessarily astonishment, but a serious recognition of the moral concession she had made. There would surely be disappointment. He would be disgusted by the deliberate psychological harm done to another individual as a man of principles and medicine. There may be resentment at the manipulation itself and Victor for masterminding it, rather than the deceit of Phyllis, with whom he had a complex past. He would see the whole plan for what it was, a battle fought through a proxy that was incredibly immoral and personal. However, a thread of pity would probably be entwined with this condemnation. Nate was not naive, he was aware of the demands of living in Victor Newman's orbit. He would understand Audra's professional reasoning for accepting the task and the tremendous pressure she was under. However, he would become more worried about the act's effects on Audra's character than the deed itself. He would wonder how such acts affected a person's soul, how each compromise facilitated the next, and where the line would be drawn in the end. The dynamics at play were drastically changed by the fallout from this confession. A third party was now aware of the Phyllis Project's workings, which had previously only been known to Victor and Audra. By virtue of his knowledge, Nate in a sense became complicit, carrying a burden of a reality that he could not readily divulge without causing Audra great harm. They formed a new, covert alliance as a result, but it was tense and morally dubious. The main problem in Audra's relationship with Nate was trust, the very thing she had been abusing with Phyllis. Would he ever be able to trust her? Would she ever be honest with him again? Because of the confession, their connection had to be reevaluated, going from a possibly surface-level attraction to a deeper, more complex friendship based on a dark secret they both shared. Confession was a cathartic release for Audra, but it did not relieve her of the mission. Now that Nate's disappointed, watching eyes were on her, she was even more ensnared in Victor's web. The deceit would be even more agonizing because every encounter with Phyllis would now be viewed through the prism of Nate's imagined judgment, even if the mission would still need to go on. Audra's confession to Nate was a potent microcosm of life in Genoa City's upper classes on a larger scale. It exposed the human cost of Victor Newman's constant planning. He saw individuals as chessboard pieces that might be moved, sacrificed, or used to further a greater good. The Phyllis Project was personal, not professional, and Audra was its collateral damage. Her integrity was a loss that might be tolerated in order to get rid of a bother. Her struggles demonstrated how the games they were made to play might leave even the most driven players emotionally damaged. The incident also brought attention to the recurrent issue of confession as a narrative device inside the intricate urban social fabric. Power was based on secrets, but human connection was based on their disclosure. After weeks of living a lie, Audra was trying to regain some of her humanity and establish a genuine connection with someone by confessing to Nate. In the moral quagmire of her behavior, she was looking for a rock. In the end, the confession marked a terrible new beginning rather than a conclusion. It made the Phyllis issue far more confusing rather than better. It added a new level of moral doubt and emotional danger to Audra's existence. Although the secret was now shared, it seemed heavier in many respects since it was now mirrored in the eyes of someone whose opinion was very important to her. The entire experience served as a sobering reminder that, in a society where gaining power is the ultimate goal, the most important conflicts are frequently waged within people's consciences rather than in boardrooms. The sound of Audra's confession, echoing in the quiet room between her and Nate, was far more important than any corporate triumph or setback. It was the moment her conscience roared back to life. Perhaps it was the sound of a soul rediscovering itself as it struggled to balance who it wanted to be in the eyes of another with who it needed to be to survive.